a discovery could potentially give them influence on a global scale. So, global domination. But how could anyone realistically control a person's mind? That was the question that MKUltra was created to answer. Researchers involved in the program were prepared to explore every method imaginable in the hopes that something would prove successful. And these methods included horrifying practices such as luring unsuspecting people from the streets, secretly drugging them, administering electric shocks, and exposing them to extreme forms of psychological torment. Now, MKUltra was actually an umbrella term for multiple different experiments, so MKUltra itself was just like a code name, an umbrella term that all these experiments went underneath, but they had individual names themselves. The program also stretched outside of the United States, and numerous experiments were conducted around the world. MKUltra officially started in 1953, and every aspect of it was top secret. And for the next 20 years, these brutal experiments were being performed without the general public having any knowledge of it. When selecting participants for these experiments, the CIA focused on people that they considered expendable. Essentially, people that would attract little attention if they disappeared or something bad happened to them. People whose absence wouldn't be noticed. So they often targeted people who have been marginalised or viewed with suspicion, such as criminals and prison inmates and psychiatric patients. People who had entered hospitals for treatment and care, but ended up becoming subjects in secret experiments instead. There are also reports suggesting that captured enemy agents were abducted and used as test subjects. No two MKUltra projects were alike, and every victim experienced something different, but they were all subjected to relentless physical and psychological abuse. They were pushed to the very edge of what they could endure, whilst researchers continuously questioned them, monitored their reactions, and carefully recorded the results. The scientists wanted to understand exactly how these experiments altered the human brain. The ultimate objective was to gain a deeper understanding of how the mind functioned, because if they could fully understand it, perhaps they could dismantle it. The man that was placed in charge of MKUltra was a research chemist named Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, and he oversaw the entire operation. Before he became the head of MKUltra, Gottlieb had spent roughly a decade working in government laboratories, and receiving the control of MKUltra was something he viewed as an incredible opportunity. He was very patriotic and eager to contribute to his country in any way he could. He had actually applied to serve during World War II and fight on the front lines, but due to a deformity in his feet, he was deemed unable to serve on the battlefield, and Gottlieb was disappointed with that. But when he got this opportunity to head MKUltra, he felt like this was his way of being able to serve his country, and he believed that he might discover a technique or a drug that could control people's minds and perhaps win them the Cold War. One of the very first priorities after taking charge hallucinations are the most common feature of LSD use. However, what someone actually experiences and sees is unique to them, and a person's emotional state highly influences the nature of the experience. So if someone is anxious or upset or just in a negative mind space, all those emotions can become dramatically intensified, and sounds, feelings, and your everyday ordinary sensations might start to feel very unsettling or even frightening. On the other hand, if someone is feeling more positive and happy and joyous, they're more likely to have an enjoyable experience. Not always the case, but as a general rule, if you're feeling okay, the experience is likely going to be okay. And some may even describe it as euphoric. They see colours more vividly, they feel music, and they're moved by it, and everything seems to be joyous and amusing. And the intensity of the experience also depends on how much is consumed. But for some people, taking LSD or any hallucinogenic drug can unfortunately result in lifelong psychological scars. Roughly 4% of users develop a condition called hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD. And basically it just kind of means that they experience a trip for the rest of their lives. It's like it never wears off, and they'll have really disturbing hallucinations and visual disturbances. It might not last a lifetime, but it could last weeks, months before it wears off. And because LSD also alters judgment and behaviour, users may say or do things that they wouldn't normally consider. So if the experience is positive, it's likely that those actions would be harmless, but if you're having a bad trip, they could potentially become a danger to themselves or people around them. There have even sadly been cases of people taking their own lives whilst under the influence of LSD and having a bad experience. Now, Sydney Gottlieb was captivated by LSD, but because it was so new, it was difficult to get hold of. At the time, only a single company in Switzerland held the rights to manufacture it. So Gottlieb contacted the company directly and asked how much LSD they had available. The company said that they had 10 kilograms in stock, and Gottlieb offered $250,000 for 10 kilos worth of LSD. The agreement was made, and the CIA dispatched personnel to Switzerland to go and collect the shipment. But when they arrived, they did not get 10 kilograms, they got 10 grams. 10 grams of LSD for $250,000. They'd either been scammed or there was a serious miscommunication. And obviously 10 grams was not enough for the experiment. exactly would their breaking down look like? Now, Sidney Gottlieb had developed several theories of his own. He believed that administering sufficiently large quantities of LSD might effectively wipe away a person's existing consciousness, reducing the mind to like an empty slate. And if that was possible, he reasoned that those vacant minds could then be rebuilt with entirely new beliefs, ideas, and loyalties. In other words, if someone's original personality and convictions could be erased and replaced with new ones, then true mind control might be possible. Under Gottlieb's direction, mind control research was secretly financed through universities, scientific institutions, and prisons across the United States. Eventually the program expanded and reached countries such as Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, all of which were under significant American influence during that time period. Across the world, people were unknowingly and unwittingly being subjected to horrific psychological experiments. They were given dangerously large doses of LSD, monitored constantly, and documented every step of the way, all without their consent as to what they were getting into. And some experiments even involved children. In fact, there are individuals still alive today who recall being handed cups of Kool-Aid that had secretly been laced with LSD. They said they remember sitting in rooms along with other children, all drinking the same Kool-Aid, and start having powerful hallucinations, but their children say they have no idea what is going on with them and what's happening, and it's highly likely that their parents didn't know anything about it either. Those who went through this experience said it was incredibly frightening, and I can't imagine being a child that has no concept or understanding of drugs and hallucinations, apart from maybe like a dream, and all of a sudden everything around you is changing and warping and moving, and you don't know what is going on. And it made me wonder if this is where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid has come from. You know how people say, oh, you've been drinking the Kool-Aid? Is this why? Because a bunch of kids drank Kool-Aid laced with LSD and it started making them think differently and act differently? I don't know. Just a thought. But despite the scale of MK Ultra's program, it had remarkably little government oversight. There was virtually no supervision, so Sidney Gottlieb just oversaw the project himself and kind of had free rein to do whatever he wanted. The program had very few clearly defined rules or ethical boundaries, and everything was treated as an experiment. Researchers were effectively handed living human beings and told to discover whatever they could by any means that they considered necessary, and that's exactly what they did. Altogether, the MK Ultra program is believed to have included more than 150 separate human experiments, one of which was called Operation Midnight Climax, which was led in New York by George Hunter White, and the primary objective of this experiment was to see how LSD influenced sexual behavior. In order to carry out the study, White recruited a number of women to pose as sex workers, and they would go out to bars and nightclubs and lure men back to what they thought would be a brothel, but little did they know that it wasn't a brothel. It was a CIA safe house, where agents and researchers were sat behind a two-way mirror, observing and recording everything that took place. So these men believed that they were spending the night with attractive sex workers, but instead they were about to become unwitting participants in a government experiment. Once the women brought the men back to the house, they approached them said that they didn't want to take it. The women simply slipped it into their drink without their knowledge, and they had it anyway. To prepare for Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA actually employed a professional magician to teach the women how to do sleight of hand so that they could slip LSD into their drinks without being noticed. Those involved in running the operation later claimed that the atmosphere felt less like scientific research and more like a party. So maybe at first it feels kind of innocent, but ultimately they're drugging people without their consent. But Dr. Sidney Gottlieb earned the darkest reputation of them all. He became infamous for his complete disregard for ethical boundaries, both inside and outside the lab. Animal experimentation was commonplace under his direction. Employees would sometimes arrive at work on Monday mornings to find dead monkeys scattered throughout the lab after Gottlieb had poisoned, gassed, or otherwise used them in experiments over the weekend. On one occasion, he invited all of his staff to spend a relaxing weekend at his large country home. He said that this would be like a work bonding experience, you know, they'd all have a nice relaxing weekend, good food, drinks, and just get to know each other better and relax together. But as the evening began, when everyone got there and they were eating dinner and having drinks, before long, one after the other, they all started to notice that they felt wrong. Reality didn't feel normal anymore. It was as though they were drifting into a dream, watching the world around them become distorted. And only then did Sidney Gottlieb reveal that he had dosed them all with LSD. He advised them to stay calm and enjoy the experience. According to Gottlieb, this was merely another experiment on his own staff. He wanted to find out whether LSD could lower people's inhibitions enough to make them reveal confidential information. In other words, he was testing whether his own employees could be trusted with sensitive secrets, whilst also exploring whether the same tactic might eventually be used against foreign enemies. The official outcome of this experiment remains unclear, but what happened afterwards is disturbing. One of the employees who was at this weekend getaway and got dosed with LSD would later lose his life. Several days after the incident, Frank Olson approached Sidney at work and explained that he still didn't feel like himself after taking the LSD. The experience had affected him so deeply that he was seriously considering leaving the project altogether, and he felt violated by what had happened. Trying to calm the situation, Gottlieb reassured him and suggested that he visit a specialist psychiatrist in New York who supposedly had experience treating cases like his. So Frank agreed and felt optimistic. He believed the treatment might finally help him recover and allow him to return to a normal life. During the consultation, Frank described everything he had been struggling with since the LSD exposure. He explained that he felt constantly confused. Simple everyday tasks had become difficult. He found himself forgetting people's names and sometimes even failing to recognize people that he knew. It felt like half of his mind had simply disappeared, while the other half was desperately trying to function. The psychiatrist reassured Frank that recovery was possible. He was told that treatment could help and that there was reason to remain hopeful, and the appointment ended on a positive note. And yet, later that same night, Frank Olson died after falling from a window on the 13th floor of his hotel, and his death was officially ruled as self-inflicted. At the time, many people accepted that ruling. Given the severe psychological stress that Frank had been reporting since taking the LSD, it seemed many observers, the official explanation didn't seem convincing. And if it wasn't self-inflicted, then it seemed obvious that the alternative was homicide. But if Frank Olsen had been murdered, who by and why? One theory suggests that his death formed part of a much larger cover-up. Some believe he may have been silenced before he could expose details of the secret LSD experiments. Others speculate that his deteriorating condition reflected badly on the research itself, and that removing him prevented inconvenient evidence from undermining the program or damaging claims about LSD's potential. Frank Olsen's family eventually filed legal action against the CIA over the suspicious circumstances surrounding his death, and in time they accepted a settlement worth $750,000. But even so, many of their questions still remained unanswered. One of the things his family requested was a personal meeting with Sidney Gottlieb. And at this point, more than 2 decades has passed since Frank died, and Gottlieb was now an elderly man, and Frank's children were adults. When they first arrived at Gottlieb's house, Gottlieb looked at them, let out a sigh of relief, and said, "I'm so glad you didn't bring a weapon. I dreamt last night that you came here and shot me." Bit of an odd thing to say to people you just met, and the comment makes people wonder if he was carrying a guilty conscience. Looking back years later, Frank Olsen's son said he came to believe that Gottlieb had behaved in a highly manipulative manner throughout their meeting, presenting himself as the victim rather than accepting any responsibility for what had happened. Frank's son later explained that before they had even stepped inside the building, they were already apologizing to him and trying to reassure him that they understood what Gottlieb and his family had been through. For the rest of the meeting, he said that things were fairly ordinary. Gottlieb answered the questions that the family had, but at one point he turned towards Frank's son and made a very unusual statement. He said, "Your father and I were actually very similar. We both entered this line of work because we felt we were doing something patriotic, but we both ended up taking things too far, and we both did things that we probably should not have done." And that's the closest Sidney Gottlieb has ever come to acknowledging any wrongdoing when it came to Frank Olsen and that whole situation. More than 10 years after the meeting, Frank's son still wasn't satisfied. He had so many unanswered questions, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on him. So eventually he made the decision to have his father's body exhumed from his grave, in the hopes of having another autopsy. Of course, at this point, nearly 30 years had passed, so the body was only skeletal remains, but despite that, his son believed it was worth doing. So, Frank Olsen's remains were exhumed and examined, and the results were fairly significant. During the examination, investigators discovered an injury on his skull above his left eye. A section of the skull had been fractured, and this was strange because when Frank died after falling from the hotel window, his family were told that he had landed on his back, and that the damage was mainly to the back of his skull. But then why was there another major injury at the front of his head? The pathologist who examined the remains believed that this injury could potentially indicate that Frank had been struck with some kind of object before he fell, or was pushed, or jumped from the window. And what makes this even more interesting is that the injury at the front of his skull was never mentioned to his family after his initial autopsy. Nobody ever explained it. Nobody had even known it existed until his remains were examined decades later. Does that prove that there was some kind of cover-up? No, but the reality is we will probably never know what truly happened with Frank. But what we do know is that he was given LSD without consent or knowledge, and because of that, he lost his life. And whilst Frank was an example of someone who had absolutely no idea that he was being experimented on, many other MKUltra subjects technically volunteered, but they didn't really know what they were signing up for. They believed they were participating in ordinary psychological research or harmless clinical studies. They might have been told that researchers were simply examining things like mental health or human behaviour, so they were willingly giving their consent to participate, but they had no idea how extreme the experiments would become or what would actually be done to them. As I said, a large number of the experiments took place inside prisons, and many of these prison studies were carried out on a so-called voluntary basis by inmates who agreed to participate because they were given incentives of possibly reduced sentences or other benefits. One particular prison experiment involved researchers claiming that they were trying to discover a treatment for schizophrenia. Around 19 inmates from a prison in Atlanta volunteered to take part. Among those prisoners was a man named James Bulger, or Bulger, not sure, but he went by his nickname Whitey, and at that time he was considered one of Boston's most feared organised crime figures. So he took part thinking that he was helping to find a cure for schizophrenia, but what he didn't know was that he was about to become a part of MKUltra experiments that would continue for a year. For 12 months, Whitey and other participants were given LSD on a daily basis. And years later, he described that period of his life as a complete nightmare, an experience that pushed him towards the edge of insanity. He said he began hearing voices, became extremely anxious, and his mental state deteriorated dramatically. The experience affected him so deeply that he developed the belief that if he ever told anyone about the suffering he was experiencing, it would somehow be a trap. The LSD had convinced him that he simply had to endure everything silently, because speaking out would lead to something terrible happening. Another fear he reported was being transferred to a psychiatric institution, which at the time were incredibly harsh and abusive environments. During the 1950s, many psychiatric facilities were places where patients were treated terribly, and in some cases people with mental illnesses were treated even worse than prisoners. So Whitey would rather have remained incarcerated than risk being labelled as insane and sent to an asylum. So because of that fear, he kept everything to himself and endured the entire year-long experiment secretly. Years later, after the experiment had ended, Whitey was eventually released from prison and his life took an even darker direction. He would go on to become a notorious serial killer. He was eventually linked to numerous murders, and he was eventually captured and imprisoned again later in life. Whitey blamed his violent behaviour partly on what had happened to him during MKUltra. He claimed that the experiments had changed him, leaving him with an overwhelming amount of anger and aggression, and that eventually all those emotions came out in the worst possible way. Whitey argued that if he had never been subjected to those experiments, he might not have gone on to kill anyone. And Whitey wasn't the only person connected to MKUltra who would later go on to commit horrific crimes. Another controversial figure linked to MKUltra was Ted Kaczynski. When he was 16 years old, he enrolled at Harvard University. He was considered exceptionally intelligent from a very young age and skipped 2 years of school, entering university at the age of 16. And it was during his time at Harvard, whilst he was still a teenager, that he became involved in a psychological study connected with MK some other cases, we don't know exactly what was done to him. We don't know precisely what researchers were attempting to study. It's unclear if he was given LSD, whether he was subjected to other psychological experiments, or the full extent of what truly happened. But what we do know is that many MKUltra experiments were aggressive, invasive, and damaging. They were not designed to be comfortable experiences. And later in life, Ted Kaczynski became known as the Unabomber. He carried out a series of bombings using homemade explosive devices sent through the mail, killing 3 people and injuring 23 others. So that's 2 examples of people connected to MKUltra who later became involved in extreme violent behaviour. But now we're going to talk about perhaps one of the most disturbing figures involved in the entire MKUltra program, Dr. Donald Cameron. Dr. Cameron became infamous because of the experiments he carried out on psychiatric patients. People who had come to him because they trusted him as a doctor and believed that he was there to help them. Instead, he used them as research subjects. Many of Dr. Cameron's methods were completely untested and highly experimental. Some of his treatments involved LSD, but his work went far beyond that. He was also a strong supporter of electroshock therapy and used it extensively on his patients. Another one of his methods involved what he called the sleep room, which was essentially a large room filled with hospital beds where patients were placed into medically induced comas, and he would keep people unconscious for extremely long periods of time. A person would come to him desperate for help, saying they were struggling mentally and needed treatment, and his response would be to place them in a coma for weeks at a time. He also frequently used sensory deprivation as part of his experiments, but not the nice calming type that we're aware of today. They were designed to be extreme. Many of the patients were under the influence of LSD during the process, which made the entire experience even more frightening. Doctors who supervised some of these sensory deprivation experiments reportedly had to intervene because patients would become so distressed that they would scream in panic. Dr. Cameron believed that all of this was necessary for what he called de-patterning. And the idea behind de-patterning was essentially breaking down a person's existing personality and memories before rebuilding them in the desired way. But the methods he used to achieve this were extreme. After placing patients through drug-induced sleep, sensory deprivation, and repeated electroshock treatments, he would then move on to the next stage of the process that he called psychic driving. The idea behind psychic driving was that once a patient's mind had been stripped down, new thoughts and ideas could be implanted through repeated messages. The process would begin with a patient undergoing a detailed psychiatric assessment, during which doctors would try to identify the person's emotional weaknesses, the things that made them the most upset, their deepest fears, their insecurities, and the subjects that caused the strongest emotional reactions, and this entire session would be recorded. Afterwards, researchers would go through the recordings and select specific phrases or moments that they believed would have the greatest psychological impact on the patient. And they would then take those selected pieces of audio and replay them back to the patient over and over, sometimes for up to 20 hours a day, every single day. And as you can imagine, hearing these types of things that are your deepest fears causes extreme psychological trauma. Some of the phrases that they were forced to listen to were things like, "Everyone hates you," "Your mother is disappointed in you," "You are worthless." And the sounds would come through like a tannoy system in the room, but they were also given a helmet that had speakers inside of it, so they were constantly surrounded by these messages. And the researchers even placed speakers inside their pillows so that as they were sleeping, these voices were being played out to them. Many patients were left almost unrecognizable compared to what they had been before the experiment. They became dependent on hospital staff for basic needs. Some even regressed into a childlike state. Some lost complete control of bodily functions and needed to wear nappies. Others needed to be tube fed and cared for by medical staff because they could no longer function independently. Many patients struggled to remember who they were. They forgot important parts of their lives and they just became overwhelmed with fear and anxiety. One patient who experienced this was a woman named Esther Schreier. She arrived at the hospital desperately looking for help with her mental health because a few years earlier she had given birth to a baby boy who had sadly passed away after 2 months. She then later had another child who survived and was healthy, but Esther was struggling with severe postnatal depression and she was overwhelmed and struggling emotionally. So she went to Dr. Cameron's hospital hoping he could help her, but instead Dr. Cameron said he wanted to place her in the sleep room. His solution was 30 days in a medically induced coma. I'm not entirely sure what that is meant to do to help. And this was one of the longest periods that anyone had been kept in the sleep room. By the time Esther came out, she was completely transformed for the worse. She'd lost around 12 pounds of weight during that month, and because she'd spent so much time unconscious with no physical movement, the muscles in her legs had deteriorated so badly that she struggled to stand. She was incredibly weak. But this was only the beginning. The next stage of the treatment involved electroshock therapy. According to Cameron's theory, the purpose was to trigger controlled seizures in the brain in an attempt to eliminate symptoms associated with mental illness. Esther was subjected to a total of 29 major electric shocks, and by the end of the process, the results were devastating. Her brain function had been severely affected. After just over a month at the facility, doctors considered her to have been successfully de-patterned. But the person who left the hospital was unrecognizable to who she was when she went in. She had become a shell of who she once was. She was incontinent. She couldn't speak. She struggled to communicate with anyone around her. She had difficulty swallowing and could not properly feed herself. But perhaps the most horrifying part of Esther's story was that nobody realized during this process she was pregnant. It's also unclear whether Esther knew she was pregnant herself. Eventually, Esther gave birth to a baby boy who was named Lloyd, but he was quickly taken away from her and placed into care because she was simply unable to look after him. The treatment had reduced her to a state where she could barely care for herself, never mind raise a child. And this is what makes her story so heartbreaking. She had gone to the hospital to get help so that she could become healthy again and be the best mother she could be. But instead, she left broken and completely dependent on others. Esther herself has since passed away, but her son Lloyd is still alive today and has spent years trying to have his experience recognized. He believes that he too was a victim of MK-Ultra experimentation. But the problem is that officially he's not classified as a victim because the experiments were performed on his mother rather than directly on him. However, the argument remains that he was still affected by what happened. He was exposed to the consequences of the experiments that his mother went through whilst he was inside of her. Lloyd explained that he developed more slowly than other children his age. Thankfully, the effects didn't appear to completely control his life, but there were noticeable developmental delays, and the reality is that nobody truly knows what impact those experiments could have on an unborn child. And Esther's case was not unique. Many of Dr. Cameron's patients experienced similar outcomes. revelation surrounding MKUltra eventually led to government investigations. In the 1970s, the program began receiving public attention after journalists and investigators uncovered evidence of illegal CIA activities. The US government eventually admitted that MKUltra had existed and that numerous unethical experiments had taken place. However, a huge amount of information about the program was lost forever. In 1973, the CIA director Richard Helms was removed from his position by President Nixon, who considered him to be disloyal. After Helms was forced out, he and Sidney Gottlieb made the decision that MKUltra needed to disappear. They wanted as much evidence destroyed as possible, so Gottlieb went to the CIA Record Center and ordered the destruction of boxes upon boxes of MKUltra documents. Thousands of records were destroyed, and the vast majority of the documents disappeared forever. In 1974, some remaining documents connected to MKUltra were eventually released to the public. The surviving documents revealed hundreds of experiments carried out across universities, hospitals, prisons, and other institutions. But the missing records left countless unanswered questions. How many people were actually experimented on? How many lives were permanently damaged? And how many victims never even discovered what had been done to them? And whilst MKUltra officially ended in the early 1970s, its legacy continues to fascinate and disturb people today. The program became one of the most infamous examples of government experimentation in modern history, a case where the pursuit of knowledge and power crossed ethical boundaries in ways that could cause real harm to real people. When the public discovered what had actually taken place, they wanted answers. Victims wanted accountability and families wanted justice, so several lawsuits were launched against those responsible. Some victims did receive settlements, such as Frank Olson, and he also got a public apology from the President of the United States, but not every family received the same outcome. Another victim's family fought for years to hold the government accountable for what had been done, but ultimately the government prevented them from receiving compensation. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled that it was completely unacceptable for the CIA to conduct experiments on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. I mean, isn't that obvious? However, despite this ruling, very few people involved in MKUltra were ever truly punished because so much evidence had been destroyed. There were no records existing to show who was truly responsible. Over the years, many people have come forward claiming that they were unknowingly involved in MKUltra experiments. Some say they were drugged without their knowledge during the 50s and 60s. And many of these stories contain details that closely resemble MKUltra methods. They describe experiences involving strange behaviour, unexplained memory gaps, psychological distress, and being exposed to substances or situations that they never consented to. But because they weren't able to provide concrete evidence, their stories were dismissed. But MKUltra wasn't just limited to experiments involving drugs and psychological manipulation. Some of the research became so unusual that it almost sounds fictional. One being Operation Acoustic Kitty. The idea behind this project was exactly what it sounds like, using a cat as a surveillance device. Researchers wanted to turn an ordinary house cat into a living spy. They performed surgery on the animal, implanting a microphone inside its body, with the goal of sending the cat into an area with individuals that they wanted to gather information from secretly, and the cat would be a walking listening device. But they forgot one important detail. They had not trained the cat in any way, so when they released it into the field, the cat simply did what a cat does and ran away, and did not perform their mission. And according to reports, this cat was eventually hit by a taxi investigation was completely abandoned, but I do believe they experimented with pigeons as well, doing the same sort of thing, but had the same outcomes. It didn't go anywhere, and ultimately they didn't get any results with this, but they didn't with humans either, really. They just ruined people's lives. MK Ultra is also connected to one of the most infamous names in criminal history, Charles Manson. There's a theory that Manson may have had some connection to MK Ultra and that he was exposed to psychological techniques that later influenced the way he manipulated his followers, known as the family. Through a combination of manipulation, fear, isolation, and psychological control, he convinced members of the group to carry out a series of horrific murders in 1969. However, there's no proof of this, it's just a theory, but there is a book that I read called Chaos, and I believe it's by Tom O'Neill, and that book is very interesting. It does show some connections that Charles Manson had with the CIA, and it's, again, just a theory. There's no definitive conclusion, but it's very interesting and worth a read if it's something that you are